Singapore is buying a country, not with tanks, not with soldiers, with sand. Right now, ships are crossing the ocean, loaded with millions of tons of it, headed for a nation that is quietly, deliberately, making itself bigger. Since 1965, this country has grown by almost 25%. Not through conquest, not through treaties. It has been building new land one shipment at a time, and the world barely noticed. But here's what they don't tell you in the headlines. This obsession with land has triggered a diplomatic crisis, drained rivers dry in neighboring countries, and forced Singapore into a race against a threat that could erase everything it's built. Every inch of new coastline is a bet against the sea itself. This is the story of a country that had no land to spare and decided to make some anyway. In 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, kicked out, left to fend for itself with no natural resources, no farmland, and barely 224 square miles of territory to its name. Its prime minister at the time, Lee Kuan Yew, wept on national television. He believed his country was finished before it even started. 60 years later, Singapore is one of the wealthiest nations on earth, and one of the reasons is almost too strange to believe. It decided that if it didn't have enough land, it would simply manufacture more. Today, Singapore is roughly 176 square kilometers larger than it was at independence. That's not a rounding error. That's an area bigger than the city of Boston, conjured out of open water. And the country isn't stopping. By 2030, official plans call for even more expansion, pushing the coastline further into the sea than most people would think physically possible. So how do you build a country? And what does it cost the countries around you when you do? The impossible math. Singapore's problem was simple, brutal arithmetic. A tiny island, no mountains to mine, no oil to drill, and a population that kept climbing. By the 1960s, planners looked at a map and saw a country running out of room to exist. Most nations solve overcrowding by building upward. Singapore did that too, the skyline is proof. But there's a limit to how many people you can stack into towers before infrastructure buckles, before ports can't expand, before airports run out of runway. Singapore needed something more radical. The answer came from an unlikely place, the Netherlands. For centuries, the Dutch had been fighting the sea, draining swampland, and building dikes to reclaim territory from the water. Singapore looked at that playbook and asked a different question. Instead of just holding back the ocean, what if they filled it in? The process sounds almost too simple to work. Take sand, dump it into shallow coastal water, compact it, layer it, let it settle. Do this for years across thousands of acres, and eventually, where there was once open sea, there is solid ground you can build a runway on. But simple doesn't mean easy, and it definitely doesn't mean cheap. Here's the number that should stop you cold. Singapore has imported more sand than almost any other country on Earth. Not oil, not steel. Sand. Over 517 million tons of it, according to UN data since 1965. And that number comes with a hidden cost that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the countries forced to hand that sand over. Part 2. The Sand Wars. Sand doesn't just appear. It has to be dredged, scraped from riverbeds, sea floors, and coastlines somewhere else. And somewhere else has increasingly meant Singapore's own neighbors. For decades, Indonesia sold sand to Singapore by the shipload. Entire islands began vanishing. Not metaphorically, literally disappearing beneath the waterline as their sand was stripped away and shipped across the strait. Fishing communities watched the coastlines they'd known their whole lives simply erode into nothing. In 2007, Indonesia had seen enough. It banned sand exports to Singapore entirely, citing environmental destruction and the outright disappearance of small islands near its border with the city-state. Malaysia followed with its own restrictions, then Vietnam. Then Cambodia. Each time a supplier shut its doors, Singapore didn't stop building. It found another source. Sand smuggling networks emerged in the shadows of Southeast Asia, illegal dredging operations feeding a black market built entirely around one nation's hunger for more territory. Environmental journalists have called it sand mafias, armed operations protecting illicit dredging sites because the demand from Singapore's construction boom made the sand worth more than gold in some local economies. This is the part of the story that never makes it into the glossy skyline photos. Every new acre of Singapore has a footprint somewhere else. A river that ran differently, an island that used to be there, a fishing village that isn't. And yet the reclamation didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. Because Singapore wasn't just building land anymore. It was building the future of its entire economy on top of it. You'd think a country under this much international pressure would scale back. Instead, Singapore did something almost nobody expected. It stopped relying on sand from anyone else and built something to replace it entirely. What it engineered next didn't just solve the sand crisis, it turned Singapore's biggest weakness into one of its greatest technical achievements, engineering the impossible. In the early 2000s, Singapore's government made a decision that would define the next phase of the country's expansion, reduce dependence on imported sand, and pioneer new methods entirely. One of them is called the polder method. Another borrowed idea from the Dutch. Instead of filling the sea with sand from the bottom up, engineers build a wall around a section of ocean, then pump the water out entirely, the way you drain a bathtub. What's left is dry land sitting below sea level, protected by pumps and barriers working around the clock forever. Singapore's Pulau Tekong project used exactly this technique, saving hundreds of millions of dollars in sand and creating land that didn't require dredging a single foreign riverbed. Then there's Tuas, the most ambitious reclamation project in Singapore's history, a new megaport being built entirely on reclaimed land, designed to eventually become the largest fully automated container terminal on Earth. When finished, it will be capable of handling 65 million containers a year. That's not a port. That's an economic engine, built from scratch, on land that didn't exist a generation ago. But there was still one problem no amount of Dutch engineering could solve. The very reason Singapore needed more land in the first place, rising seas, was the same force threatening to swallow the land it had already built. Because here's the terrifying twist in this story. The ocean Singapore has spent 60 years pushing back is now rising to meet it. And the very ground the country built with its own hands could be the first thing it loses. The race against the tide. Climate scientists project that sea levels around Singapore could rise by up to a meter by the end of the century. For most countries, that's a slow, manageable problem. For Singapore, a nation whose economy, airport, port, and financial district sit on reclaimed land often barely above sea level, it's an existential one. In 2019, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong stood at the country's National Day rally and said something no leader wants to say out loud, that defending against rising seas could cost Singapore over 100 billion Singapore dollars over the next century. That's not a construction budget. That's closer to the cost of fighting a war, except the enemy is the tide, and it never stops advancing. The response has been staggering in scale. Singapore is now designing an entirely new coastal defense system, including a set of man-made islands off its eastern shore called the Long Island Project, a barrier designed to protect the coast from storm surges while creating even more usable land behind it. It's reclamation and defense fused into a single structure. Land that exists specifically to protect the land that came before it. Think about what that means. Singapore isn't just building more country. It's building armor for the country it already has. And this is where the story stops being about ambition and starts being about survival. Every acre of sand this nation has fought for, smuggled, engineered, and defended all of it, is now on the front line of a war against rising water that Singapore did not start and cannot lose. Singapore didn't inherit its land. It built it grain by grain, ship by ship, decade by decade, against the will of the ocean and sometimes against the will of its own neighbors. It turned a nation with almost nothing into one of the most powerful economies on the planet, using little more than sand ambition and an unwillingness to accept the borders it was given. But this is a story without a final chapter, because the same forces that made Singapore's expansion necessary, rising seas, a warming planet, a world running short on the raw materials this kind of engineering demands, are only intensifying. Singapore spent 60 years proving that land is not a fixed thing, that borders can be built, not just drawn. The question now is whether it can defend everything it created before the sea decides to take it back.